former GOP congressman says Trump is psychologically, morally, intellectually and emotionally unfit for office, and he will consider voting for a Democrat in 2020. Dave Trott, a Republican who represented suburban Detroit for 2 terms, and decided not to run for a third earlier this year, has unloaded on Donald Trump. Trott, among former GOP office holders choosing not to seek re-election and openly voice concerns over Trump, said he was unfit for office. Specifically, Trump was psychologically, morally, intellectually, and emotionally unfit, says Trott in a letter responding to a November article in The Atlantic. He also said that he will likely have to consider turning to the Democrats when he decides who to vote for in the 2020 presidential election, and he says that he's open to former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg's candidacy. By Ralph R. Ortega for DailyMail.com, published 1:12 Greenwich Mean Time, the 26th of December 2019, updated 7:32 Greenwich Mean Time, the 26th of December 2019. Retired Republican Congressman Dave Trott has hit out at President Donald Trump, calling him psychologically, morally, intellectually, and emotionally unfit for office. Trott also said that he will likely have to turn to the Democratic field of candidates when it comes to voting in the 2020 presidential election, and he was open to former New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg's candidacy. Trott made his comments in both a letter responding to a November article in The Atlantic, as well as in a recent interview with the New York Times. He is among former Republican congressional officer holders who did not seek re-election this year, while being openly critical of the president. The others include Will Hurd of Texas, Francis Rooney of Florida, and John Shimkus of Illinois. Retired Republican Congressman Dave Trott hit out at President Donald Trump in a letter to The Atlantic, and similarly in an interview with the New York Times. Trott said Trump was psychologically, morally, intellectually, and emotionally unfit for office. The President and First Lady Melania Trump are pictured arriving for Christmas Eve dinner at Mar-a-Lago in Palm Beach, Florida on Tuesday. Trott said that he will likely have to turn to the Democratic field of candidates when it comes to voting in the 2020 presidential election. Others from the party who have stayed in office have voiced their undivided support for the president, mostly evidenced by their rejection of the House's articles of impeachment, approved last week along party lines. Trott, in comments he wrote in a letter responding to an article by Mark Bowden that ran in The Atlantic, said the criticism military officials had in interviews with the news outlet regarding what it's like to work for the president was frightening, and that it was the only word he had to describe the piece. President Trump's inability or unwillingness to follow normal decision-making protocols has created chaos in our foreign policy and put our country at risk, Trott wrote in response to interviews with commanders who had common criticisms of the commander-in-chief's leadership of the armed forces. He added that the article had helped him concerning the 2020 presidential election, and that he had been flummoxed. I will now have to consider voting for a Democrat, the Republican confesses. High unemployment, a stagnating economy, and massive debt for a few years are better than alienating the rest of our allies, getting into a nuclear war with Iran, or allowing 10,000 Islamist soldiers to be set free in Syria, wrote Trott, in a comparison of what he expects from the White House under a Democrat, against the fears he has of possible consequences from Trump administration policy. Trump is psychologically, morally, intellectually, and emotionally unfit for office. Trott adds, we can only hope Congress impeaches and removes him so we have a choice between 2 adults in 2020. In an interview with The Times, published Sunday, Trott is said to have learned that anyone who defied the president faced Trump's fury, ostracism within the GOP, and a premature end to their political career as a Republican. Trott said that if he had stayed in Congress and spoken out against the president, he would have expected the president to have lashed out at him and pressured his Republican colleagues in the House to punish him. The former congressman said he did not want to seek re-election to a third term this year, as a Trumper, and told The Times that he knew was left with little future in the GOP as an opponent of the president. He again says, Trump is emotionally, intellectually and psychologically unfit for office, and he adds, I'm sure a lot of Republicans feel the same way, but if they say that, the social media barrage will be overwhelming. And he mentions to The Times that's where he's open to Bloomberg's candidacy. But if they say that, the social media barrage will be overwhelming. And he mentions to The Times that's where he's open to Bloomberg's candidacy. As for impeachment, many of the Republicans who would have supported such an effort no longer serve in Congress, The Times reports, and as Trott points out, there are now more people at Republican events than ever before. Due to the president's rising influence, every single one of them to a person will be all in for President Trump, Trott says. They'll all have "Make America Great Again" and hats on, and they'll be saying what a tremendous president he is, to prove how dissenters within the GOP don't have a chance. Trott recalled when the House voted to repeal the Affordable Care Act in 2017, and how he noticed after a Rose Garden celebration, the president pulled out a sheet of paper from his desk. He already had a list of 20 people who had voted against him 2 hours earlier, Trott remembered, The Times reports. Let's block ads. Why?